Beautiful, beautiful. Well, it's thrilling to be here with you, and I see some of my friends. I haven't been teaching for the last 6 months. I see, I guess I saw Sonia, and I think I saw Tali, and my friend Maish Hain is here. So it's good to see old Chaverim and Chaverot friends, and it's nice to see new friends. And so I'm so thankful to you, Ari, for inviting me. And I think I'm even, like, first and foremost, to Hakaras Tova, a big thank you to my dear friend Kvod Weider, Rabbi Kvod Weider, and Ilana and the family for inviting me out here to beautiful sunny Orange County, and having a chance to honor the memory of Rabbi Krauss, and also to be a part of that beautiful community this coming Shabbat. I'm looking forward to that. I'm so excited to talk to you about Chassidut. Chassidut is something that completely changed my life and changed my spiritual trajectory. As Ari pointed out in my bio, I grew up in a modern Orthodox home. My father was born in 1933 in Berlin, and escaped the Germany in a couple of months before Kristallnacht. But when he came here to the United States, he was decidedly, your average, I guess, 1950s modern Orthodox kid, centrist Orthodoxy, they might call it, Yeshiva University style Judaism. But that was only one part of the family. The other part of the family were Hasidim. And especially my cousins were all Gera Hasidim from Ger in Poland. And it was pretty common for us to be fascinated by and to go and visit them and to engage in the Hasidic world. I didn't know much about it until I went to Israel in 1987 for my gap year between high school and college. And I was exposed there to Chassidut, to Hasidism, and to the writings of various Hasidic masters in a way that I hadn't in high school. I think in high school, we didn't study Chassidut. We didn't study Hasidism. We studied the staples of, I guess, of a modern Orthodox or yeshiva curricula. And that led to, I guess, a lifelong fascination and passion for Hasidism. There was a period of my life where I left Judaism for about a decade after a period of being ultra-Orthodox. And during that time, I explored many other spiritual systems and spiritual wisdom and teachings and trainings. And when I eventually came back to Jewish life and was ordained to be a rabbi, I did so through Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, of blessed memory, who started the Renewal movement. And so Reb Zalman, who was 79 when I met him back in 2004, he was 79 years old. Reb Zalman had been a part of, I guess, a 20th century phenomena of those who had grown up in the Orthodox or in the Hasidic world, who blended Hasidism with modern sensibilities. And he himself was standing on the shoulders of others in like Martin Buber and Hillel Zeitlin and in the 20th century, who had taken some of the beauty of Hasidism, which we'll get to in a moment, and blended it in a way into something that might be considered Neo-Hasidic or Neo-Hasidism. Neo-Hasidism we'll get to in a moment, but just the Neo part is the modern or postmodern framing of this Hasidic phenomena, the Hasidic movement. And so it kind of begs the question, what is Chassidut, which we'll get to in a second. But just to round it out, it was my exposure to Reb Zalman that really reignited in me this love for Chassidut, for the movement. And I think that at this moment, as you'll see, some of the teachings of Hasidism are extremely relevant and nourishing and practical and applicable and so on. So I'm gonna share a screen with you. And my desire today is to give you an actual immersion in some of the teachings of Hasidism, like the primary sources, and give you a bit of a background about the Hasidic movement, and then also discuss some of the what I call Neo, or what is called Neo-Hasidism, and what that is and why it matters today for all of you. So I'm going to share my screen. At this point, that's kind of familiar jargon to all of us. I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully, as my students know, I always ask for a thumbs up if you can see it. Can you see this text? Yeah, cool. All right. I'm going to make this into a full screen. And I'm going to back it up a little bit and change the view. All right. What is Chassidut? This, I just want to thank Rabbi Daniel Silverstein for this beautifully laid out and creative sheet. It is Daniel is a rabbi in the yeshiva that we started. So as you can see, everybody can see the cursor here. Can everybody on board here? All right, great. Hasidut is a spiritual revival movement that sprung up in the Ukraine and Poland in the 18th century and played a decisive role in the history of East European Jewry. So that's Arthur Green, the preeminent, I think, theologian and teacher of Neo-Hasidism. To be a Hasid is to be a devotee, right? So the word chesed, which means loving kindness in Hebrew, to be a Hasid is to be a devotee, or if you want to be playful with your rendering of it, it might be a lover, someone whose spiritual practice is connected to the quality of chesed, of devotion or loving kindness. Hasidic Judaism sprung up in the collective consciousness of the Jewish people in the 18th century. It began with a Hasidic, the founder of Hasidism was called the Baal Shem Tov, which we'll get to in a moment. And this leader, this founder, this charismatic teacher, brought a revival of spirituality. So some of the background of that, right? What does it mean that the background that precipitated the Hasidic movement's emergence? So if you look on the bottom of the page, you'll see that in the decades before the emergence of Hasidut, the emergence of the Baal Shem Tov, there were a number of catastrophic events that took place, the Chmelnytsky massacres and the apostasy of Shabtai Tzvi, who was a messianic, right, a figure who claimed to be the Messiah and left the majority of the Jews at the Jewish people and Jewish population in great disarray after he converted to Islam. According to the great scholar Gershom Shalom, Hasidut was a reaction to the Sabbatian movement, to Shabtai Tzvi's movement, and we'll get to that in a bit. But Moshe Idel, the student of Shalom's, two great scholars of Kabbalah, Gershom Shalom and Moshe Idel argued that Hasidut wasn't just a reaction to the Sabbatian apostasy or the Sabbatian catastrophe, the Shabtai Tzvi catastrophe. It argued that it had its own, own intelligence, its own energy. It wasn't just a reaction to what took place with Shabtai Tzvi, and that mystical movement turned out to be a fraud. So this argument, whether Hasidism was a reaction to or emerged on its own merits, but nonetheless, both of them agree that Hasidism was a mystical movement that emerges in the beginning of the 18th century. It has its own energy. It might be a reaction to a failed mystical attempt by this messianic figure, Shabtai Tzvi. Again, there's another great event of the Jacob Frank, another failed Messiah, as you see, source number 5. And then there were other proto-Hasidic groups that were before the Baal Shem Tov appears. Now, Baal Shem Tov, though, is a figure that is legendary. Whether all of those conditions are accurately describing the milieu, I would add that at the time that the Baal Shem Tov arrives on the scene, as you'll see in a moment, in 1700, born in 1700, by the time he arrives at the scene, there's basically two ways that somebody would come close to God at that moment, or would imagine themselves as in a devotional relationship with God. One would be Talmudic study, right? Talmudic study and the legalism of Talmudic study, the sophistry of Talmudic study, like to be a Talmud Chacham, to be a student of the time, was to be someone who had the time and money and intellectual interest in pursuing the codes and the conversations in Talmud. That was, right, the most important. That was the way that you got a PhD in Judaism, was you went to Talmudic academies. Most of those academies, again, were rooted in Lithuania and so on. But that was, right, for the average person, the Tevya, Topol just passed away last week, the Tevya that lived, right, a very simple life, didn't have the time, the energy, the money, or the inclination to study Talmud. And what was the average Jew, your average Joe, your average Yasala to do when they wanted to get close to God? They weren't going to sit and open up a Masachet, a Talmudic tractate. So that was that way was maybe the most common way, and it was quite arcane. I mean, and it's not unlike what's going on today. Like your average person right? To be able to understand and engage in Jewish life and to know the liturgy and to know all of the, to know all of that, to say in order for you to have a direct relationship with God, you have to keep all of these minutiae of law and you have to learn the entire Talmud and be, a great scholar. Your average person, that's not where it is, right? And the second path that was very popular was called Musar, which means ethical, a movement that tried to make human beings develop more of their ethical attributes. And the schools of Musar were generally quite ascetic. They focused on in some way punishing the body or punishing the animal instincts, and the average person that felt they had to get close to God had to work really hard, they had to fast, and they, and to some extent they had to be willing to subdue their inclinations and subdue their natural instincts. And the Baal Shem Tov emerges in this moment, and he was a miraculous figure. They say that once when all the souls were gathered in Adam's soul, at the hour he stood before the tree of knowledge, the soul of the Baal Shem Tov went away and did not eat of the fruit of the tree. Martin Buber was maybe some argue that he was the founder of a kind of Neo-Hasidism. He took all of the tales of the Hasidic masters and made that into a kind of devotional literature. And the Baal Shem Tov was a man of the people. His biography is here in a number of bullet points. Israel ben Eliezer was known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. He was a mister, a healer, and he was also one with a good reputation. This good name, by the way, also means, as you'll see in a second, that he was a bit of a shaman. He was a bit of a healer, using not only his own good name, but the names of God. He would create amulets. He was born and lived and died in the Ukraine. His parents, Eliezer and Sarah, lived in Western Ukraine. He became an orphan at the age of 3 and was adopted by the Jewish community of Tlutz. And he became a teacher in Cheder. He wasn't even a teacher, he was a helfer. Before he was a malamed, which means an instructor, he used to be someone who just brought the children to school. So he was part of this kind of itinerant scholars. He was quite humble, but he has decided. He was introduced to Kabbalah by someone named Adam Baal Shem, or as you see in source number 8. And he became the leader of a Kabbalistic circle at the age of 18. So this miraculously, this interesting, this interesting story of, okay, I don't know who Jasper is, but this person Jasper Ari is writing some things that are not that appropriate into the chat privately to me. So I don't know if you can do something about that.
Okay, I will do it.
Okay, thank you. So the Baal Shem Tov was a hidden tzaddik. He was a hidden righteous person who became, according to folklore, became somebody who was visited by angelic teachers. Achia Shiloni, a biblical figure in the folklore, came to the Baal Shem Tov, Israel ben Eliezer, and taught him all of the secrets of Kabbalah. He and his wife Chana moved to a village in the Carpathian Mountains, and their only income was from digging clay and lime, and they had 2 children. Again, the Baal Shem Tov is classic, he became a shochet, a ritual butcher, and something happened, around the time that he was 36 years old, and he decided to reveal himself. So he reveals himself around 1740. He was 36 actually when he was really began to reveal himself, but around the time that he was 40 years old in 1740, he began to teach in Mezhbej. And in Mezhbej, which is where eventually he lives, it becomes the first Hasidic court. In other words, that's where the Baal Shem Tov began to make a name for himself, and people began to come to him. Now, I will say that before, in this number 14 that you're looking at, the hostility of those who oppose the Baal Shem Tov is also legendary. They become known as the Mitnagdim, the ones who oppose the Baal Shem Tov, mostly from the world of Vilna and the great genius of Vilna, Elijah of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon. And the Lithuanian schools and the Mitnagdim or as they're Ashkenazis, they call them misnagdim, the opponents. The opponents were terrified of what the Baal Shem Tov's innovations were, what he was trying to bring to the people. In many ways, he was a countercultural force. And it's ironic because when we think of Hasidism today, to imagine that he was, some say, there are some scholars that say that the Baal Shem Tov was one of the early reformers of Judaism, right? When we think about reform and changing the Jewish, like the landscape of Judaism, the Baal Shem Tov was quite critical of the elites. This was a kind of populist movement that was very critical of the elites and who kind of held on to the knowledge and onto the status of Judaism. And in many ways looked down their noses at the amcha, at the average person. And the Baal Shem Tov came and stirred up the imagination, the spiritual longing, and the heart of your average, maybe unlettered Jew. There are many stories about the Baal Shem Tov. I'll tell one and then I'll get into some of the key components. There's a famous story about the Baal Shem Tov that he once came to a town, and what would usually happen is that he would come to a town and he would go to the marketplace where all the people were buying produce and buying groceries and things like that. Usually women, believe it or not. There was a very strong component in early Hasidism of female students, believe it or not. And he would go to the market and he would begin to smoke a pipe. And he gave mystical reasons for smoking a pipe. It was like the high priest in the temple who had to use the incense in the temple to clarify energies. This was his language. And he began to smoke a pipe and he would tell stories. And there's one story that he told the people. He once told a story about the Talmid Chacham, the scholar, and the helper or the schlepper and the scholar. And people gathered around him as he began to tell the story. He said, there was once a schlepper in the town, let's say his name was Moshe, and there was a scholar in the town named Avram. And this Moshe was very much like Tevye. He was, always out in the field and he was working with his body and he would work from morning till evening and come home. And he never had time to study in the study hall. He never had time to pray in the synagogue. But each and every day when he would wake up in the morning, he would get, he would hitch himself to his wagon and he would begin to run around. And he would long to be a rich man. If I was a rich man, he wished that he could go and study and he wished that he could learn. And he would open up his siddur, his prayer book, and he would cry, God, give me time and space to be a learner. I wish I could be one of those, who's lucky enough to be a scholar of Talmud and the codes. And his wife would, wake him up in the morning and say, Moshe, get up. You have to go to shul. You have to go to synagogue. Moshe, you have to get up. You have to learn. And he would be so tired from working. He never was able to do it. And Baal Shem Tov said that there was a scholar in the town who had exactly the opposite problem. He was very smug about himself. He learned all morning, afternoon, and evening. He was very assured that he was on the right path. And the Baal Shem Tov told this group that had gathered in the market that one day these two characters met one another in the middle of the street. And as the Moshe the schlepper was approaching Avram the scholar, he gave out a krex, which is like a sigh, because he thought to himself, wish I could be like Avram the scholar. And as Avram passed Moshe the schlepper, he gave out a sneer. And he said, look at this Jew, he barely goes to synagogue, he doesn't do anything, he's dirty. And the Baal Shem Tov told the people gathered that when they went to heaven, they brought Moshe, they brought Moshe in, and he wasn't going to get into heaven except they brought this sigh and they put it on the other side of the scale, and the sigh itself brought him into heaven. And did the opposite with Avram the scholar. But they brought him in and he had all of these amazing mitzvot, these sacred practices, and he had all of this. And then they brought in his sneer, and the sneer itself was what that ultimately doomed him. And the Baal Shem Tov used that pedagogically to teach people about longing and yearning, and to say to them, he recognized that not everybody had the ability to sit and study, and maybe not everybody had the ability to know everything that was written in the codes or know what was written in the liturgy, but the yearning and the longing itself was worthwhile. It was so holy. And that was part of the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov, right? That your heart was more important. It was better to do something with a full heart than it was to do it with arrogance and a sense of egoic inflation. This is one of the deep Torahs of the Baal Shem Tov. Here are some other key components of the Baal Shem Tov's teaching in front of you. The Baal Shem Tov came and placed a very strong emphasis on what's known in the Zohar, the Tikkun Zohar, as late atar panui minei. There's no place devoid of God or divinity. Divine immanence, meaning that God is everywhere, right? There's no place that's devoid of God, is a radical teaching in the mystical tradition of Judaism. And it is, in a way, it collapses hierarchies. It says, you can find God on the road as you can find God in the synagogue. You can find God in the bedroom as you can find God in the temple, right? There's no place where divinity isn't. And it's a way of also underscoring that in the Hasidic worldview, every part of your life was potentially sacred. It could be sanctified. There wasn't anything that was being left out in the Hasidic worldview. And so by saying that God is everywhere, the immanence of the divine, the Baal Shem Tov was signaling, and his students also were signaling, that one didn't need a special pedigree or letters or anything like that in order to find divinity. It was closer to you than you could possibly imagine, right where you are. Now, it's a radical teaching. You can imagine that if you're a very hierarchical, Jewish life where Judaism is so grounded in separations between one thing and another, between the holy and the profane, between Shabbat and the week, right? This is a radical teaching that was met with great opposition, but it's still a part of the Jewish, it's part of Judaism, it's part of the Jewish canon. The second point, panentheism, is a big fancy word for the notion that God is both immanent and transcendent, that God is in the world, but not all of the world, that God can be found in matter as much as in spirit, but that God also is greater than all of those things. Memalek kol almin v'sovev kol almin, it means that God is, right, immanent, but also is surrounding. God is both distant, unknowable, and intimate, and intensely intimate. The third idea is called tzimtzum, that to create anything separate, God had to contract God's presence in order to create the world. This separation is an illusion in the Hasidic world, meaning it only seems to us as if God is not here. That's how, right, evil exists, is because of a contraction or a veil, but God is much closer than all of that. But there has to be a contraction of God's presence. This is a teaching from the Ari, Isaac Luria. The fourth point is that there are nitzotzot, there are sparks. I'm sure some of you have heard this, but there are sparks of God everywhere. It comes from Isaac Luria in the 16th century, but it becomes a very important part of the Hasidic worldview. Your job is to raise up those sparks, to connect them. It doesn't matter where you are. You can be, here in California, you can be in Alaska, it doesn't matter. There's a spark of divinity in the interaction between you and the world in this moment, and your job is to locate it and to lift it up. This fifth point is also a very important part of Hasidism. It is avoda b'simcha, joy, right? In contrast to the work that was happening in the Musar movement, in the Musar treaties, and the Musar works that were available before the Baal Shem Tov showed up on the scene, Hasidism placed an emphasis on doing things b'simcha, with joy. Even with Hashem b'simcha, like serve God with joy. That depression and what they call mara shchora, kind of like the dark cloud, right? That's not the way to serve God. That if you fall down, get right back up again. If you sin, it's okay. God was also there when you sinned, right? What's next? That's a very deep part of the Baal Shem Tov's Torah into the world. The sixth point is kavanah, the importance of intention and direction, right? So kavanah means literally to intend or to aim. The Baal Shem Tov believed that anything you do in the world, if it's done with the right kavanah, with the right intention, can be a way to access the divine, a portal to the presence of the divine. Number 7, pnimiyut, inwardness. The essence of religious life lies in the inner spiritual intensity. Number 8, dveikut, right? The ultimate goal for the Hasidim is to be connected or logged on to the divine. The word dveikut, which means to be attached or glued onto, is in a sense to be in God consciousness as often as possible, to be in the presence of Hashem. Tefillah, or prayer, number 9, is one of the most important also elements, and the Baal Shem Tov was a master of prayer. My own Rabbi Zalman was a master of prayer, and prayer was seen as a great portal into the presence of God. And prayer, right, even prayer that's done without the words, just the words that matter, but I'm sure many of you heard of the story that the Baal Shem Tov once told about a young shepherd boy who didn't know the words of the Siddur, of the prayer book. He had grown up without Hebrew, but he came into the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and he said, God, I don't know the letters right? I just know the alphabet, I just know the ABCs, so I'm gonna say the ABCs and you make the words for me. This was a way that the Baal Shem Tov had of introducing his followers to what was behind the words, the importance of saying things in tefillah that come from the heart. Midot, number 10. So the work on your personality, which is very much a part of the Musar movement, also exists within the Hasidic, I guess, program for human evolution or human flourishing, is to work on your ego, work on various parts of who you are in the world. And number 11 here, which is a very, very big topic in Hasidic literature, is the tzaddik, the righteous person. Now, the tzaddik in Hasidut or in Hasidism classically has to do with the holiness of a particular person, a particular personage. And there are dynasties, many dynasties with many, tzaddikim, many kind of figures that are the tzaddik or the one to whom many things are directed. But in other parts of Hasidism, the role of the tzaddik is internalized. It's not just a person outside, but the inner tzaddik, or the one in whom, right, in your own neshama, your own soul, as a locus of revelation and of wisdom. I want to say something, slightly, it's not noticed here, but I want to say that one of the greatest innovations of Hasidism was the turning around of a question that it seemed that most rabbinic literature is focusing on, which is, right, God is up there in the sky, or God is somewhere, and we are here. And most of our attempts are to understand God's Torah and to understand God, as it were, outside of us. One of the most remarkable innovations of the Baal Shem Tov was the using of Torah or text to understand the inner landscape. That everything in the Torah becomes a kind of way of understanding our own heart, mind, our own experience. Some call this a psycho-spiritualizing of the Torah, or the psychologizing of the Torah, and that the text is pointing to something in your own lived experience, and it's a jumping off from. The midrashic methodology of the Hasidic masters, the way that they approach text, is very much like midrash, but the midrashic questions are turned inward. How is this text talking about my own heart? How is this text talking about my own lived experience? Right? In the Hasidic literature, that's often the question. How does this, talking about the temple or the Mishkan or the tabernacle, how is that in my own service of God or in my own moment-to-moment experience? And in that way, just to stop before I, look at some of the, of the actual or text, the original text, the Hasidic literature is profoundly important for this moment, and why Neo-Hasidism and Reb Zalman, my teacher, really spoke to me. The question of how does this text relate to my lived experience is a question of our generation. It's really the most important language that I think now in religious language, where people are not looking necessarily for religion. They're looking for methods and tools and means to live a more evolved, flourishing life, right? So when we look at the Torah as a series of rituals and commandments and so on, that's one frame and legitimate frame. When we look at the Torah for kind of more sociological, like how Jews have been doing things for 2,000 years, that's another frame. And when we look at the Torah as a map and potentially instruction guide to living life with greater ease and with greater compassion and with greater love, that's a third frame. I think that's the frame that is most easily, translate where Hasidic literature translates into that. Right? It has a lot of the trappings, it has a lot of the language and the jargon. But the reason why Neo-Hasidism in particular can speak so much to the soul of this generation and so vital at this moment, and there's a renaissance of it, is because it's uniquely positioned to answer questions in that way. Right? How do I relate to my husband, my wife, to my neighbors in ways that are loving and compassionate? What are the impediments? What are the obstacles? How might I use these as tools to overcome them? Those were all questions that the Baal Shem Tov and his students introduced. And in some way, my teacher and others, Arthur Green and the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and others, are really mining these sources in order to speak that language and to offer those practices. I'm gonna look at a couple of texts here just to give you a taste of the Baal Shem Tov and his students. Let's look at some the students. So these texts are taken from the Baal Shem Tov's primary student, Yaakov Yosef of Polonoia. He was the first and the most dedicated of the Baal Shem Tov's students. His book, which was published in 1780, Toldos Yaakov Yosef, or the generations of Yaakov Yosef, mentions, I heard from my teacher 249 times. He was the first words in the Hasidic literature, first words of Hasidut ever published. There is let's look at source number 2 here. B'shem Mori, ki mibisari echazeh Eloha. This is a radical teaching. I mean, just to give you a sense, we're talking about the 18th century, ultra-Orthodox by any stretch of the imagination. He writes that he heard in the name of his teacher, meaning the Baal Shem Tov, his student, Yaakov Yosef, heard that the verse in Job where a character in the book of Job says, from my flesh I see God, I see the divine in my flesh. He says, this is just amazing to read this in spiritual literature in the Hasidic world. He says, just as when you are having physical coupling, it won't be productive unless you have a vital organ, right? Aroused. Like you have to be in a state of arousal, he writes, with desire and joy. So too with spiritual coupling, when you are speaking in Torah and prayer. Can you imagine this analogy? So it's like, using something that would generally be considered completely inappropriate, even though there's great sexuality in many early mystical sources. The Baal Shem Tov said to people, if you're not praying with enthusiasm, it's as if you're not doing anything. It's like you're just going through the motions, and if you want to connect with God, you have to feel aliveness and vitality. Imagine going to a shul these days. By the way, I can imagine going to a shul and sometimes and stepping up to the bima and going, excuse me, everybody, a little joy, a little enthusiasm, like a baseball game or like a hockey game. Hello, guys, get excited. There's something going on here. The Baal Shem Tov said to the people, right, let's get excited. We have to be joyous and there'll be pleasure when you pray, right? And when you serve God, do so with pleasure. His student, this is another moment. He said, this is another teaching, source number 4. He says, "V'hu davar gadol kasher kibalti min mori shebechol tsar ha'adam begashmi v'ruchani she'im noten lev shegam bazeh tsar hu Hashem yitbarach b'atzmo." This is an amazing teaching on this week's Torah portion, Parshat Vayakhel, by the student of the Baal Shem Tov, who wrote, I heard this great thing from my teacher, who wrote that in every human pain, whether it be physical or spiritual, they should pay attention that even in the pain, God himself, herself, themselves can be found. It's just that God is concealed in a garment of the pain. And when this is known, the garment is removed and the pain is nullified along with all harsh decrees. He spoke about this at great length, and the words of the wise are so sweet. Here we have a primary source, of John Kabat-Zinn, who wrote the book, Wherever You Go, There You Are. Wherever you go, there God is. You go to a place where you think, there's no way to find God in this place. So the Baal Shem Tov said, God is also in this place, except that God is garbed. God is, as it were, hidden in full view. How might we enter pain and constriction with a sense of possibility that God might be in that place too, right? Then, here's another direct teaching from the Baal Shem Tov. This one comes from his illustrious student, the Maggid of Mezrich. The Maggid of Mezrich is maybe the one most responsible for the proliferation of the movement. If the Baal Shem Tov was the founder, right, his successor, the Toldos, the one who we just studied, was the one who created the books of Hasidut. But the great student of the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid, Dovber of Mezrich, was the one who had many students. Almost every Hasidic court that we know of comes through the Maggid of Mezrich. The Maggid wrote that if you look here, the Baal Shem Tov tzarich litpalel al sonav shehem rucho shel tzadik b'gvulei v'chulei aidei tefillah nimtak b'shorsha. He says the Baal Shem Tov even taught that we should pray for our enemies, and through that work you can sweeten any judgment. said the Baal Shem Tov. Here's the last teaching from the early sources, that a person should pray for not only what they lack, but for what is lacking, as it were, in the divine. That wherever there's a lack for me, in whatever it is in my life that I'm missing, is also missing, as it were, in the broader divine universe. And so when I pray for myself, I should also be praying to support divinity, to support God in the world. And that through prayer for myself and what I'm lacking, I can also pray for what is missing, as it were, in the divine. These are some radical teachings, and it's hard to really fully, for many of us, to understand how radical they are, because to some extent, right, we have been, we're so psychologized at this point in the 21st century. Some of these things seem obvious, but they certainly were radical at the time. Other things that were innovation by the Baal Shem Tov and his students, they placed a very profound influence on brokenness and on the ability to mine the broken heart and to use the vulnerability and the exposure of the human heart as a way to enter into a relationship with God. Right? The Baal Shem Tov was very fond of quoting Psalms where it said, "Lev nishbar v'nidkeh, Elohim lo tivzeh," that a broken heart, right? God will never ever reject a broken heart. That is, one of the great offerings we can give God is our broken heart. There's a story about the Baal Shem Tov that when he had just arrived on the scene, one of his opponents actually was his brother-in-law, and he had to win his brother-in-law over, which is not uncommon, but he had to win his brother-in-law over. And apparently, when he won his brother-in-law over, he invited his brother-in-law to be the Baal Tokeh, to blow the shofar at Rosh Hashanah services. And to blow the shofar at Rosh Hashanah services was a huge deal, a big honor to be given to somebody. And as the story goes, he practiced for an entire year, thinking about all the right thoughts to have in the right moments as he blew the tekiyah, the long blast, ba-bam, or the shvarim, truah, the ba-ba, 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 like he had all the right kavanot, the right intentions. He thought he had to do it the way that, the earlier Kabbalists had to do it, with great, specificity, what to think at the right moment. It all was so important, and he thought, oh, this is a big deal. I'm on the biggest stage. I'm being entrusted by the Baal Shem Tov to blow the shofar for the entire community. And according to the tradition, at the very moment when he was about to blow the blast of the shofar, he forgot everything. It's like his mind completely blanked. And at that moment, he broke down and his heart broke, and he thought, I can't, there's no way, I have nothing. And he was about to walk off of the bima, off of the stage. And the Baal Shem Tov turned to me and said, in God's house, there are many, many rooms and many, many keys. And each key unlocks a particular room. But the master key is the broken heart. The key that unlocks every door is the broken heart. And with that, he invited his brother-in-law to come and to blow the shofar. And in that way, the Baal Shem Tov was teaching, or at least the story as it becomes a part of the canon of Hasidut, is teaching that, again, that all of the legalisms and all of the academic study and all of the mind maps and all of the complex conceptualizations, all of them are beautiful. They're all rooms, as it were. But when the heart is wide open and vulnerability is present, the Baal Shem Tov wanted to say that you have a direct access point with Hashem, right? It's right here, right now. And in that way, the Baal Shem Tov's teachings were radically dangerous. Again, I can't say this enough. They were radically dangerous. They were like DIY Judaism at that moment, like do-it-yourself Judaism, right? You don't necessarily need the high priest. You don't necessarily need this one or that one, right? And you can hear some of you who might be familiar with, in a way it was, I hate to say this, it might make it, I don't want to trivialize it, God forbid. I think that, I have at home, I have like a series of 7 books written on the deeper underpinnings of Hasidism, all of its, how the Baal Shem Tov was really playing off of earlier Kabbalah and all this. But in a way, it was also Oprah. When we talk about modern day, religion for everyone, it was Oprah, it was Deepak Chopra, it was some of the counterculture of the New Age movement here in our world, who came to people and said, you want to know about mindfulness, you can go to Tibet, and you can go to Dharamsala in India, and you can go and spend months in a monastery, but you can also just begin to follow your breath and find a local mindfulness training, and you can begin to connect with mindfulness or awareness in the present moment. And it's not that complicated, right? And the Baal Shem Tov, you can imagine the backlash that of those who oppose the Baal Shem Tov. How dare you say that God is everywhere? God is in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall. How dare you say God is closer to us than we can possibly imagine? How can you say that the average person saying Psalms is holier than King David, than the greatest scholar learning the ornate, elements of Torah? And that's part of what the revolution of Hasidism was. And so I think I can stop here, and if there are comments and any questions or anything that I can address, I have more, but I also would love to hear from all of you. There's, I still haven't touched on the uniqueness of nigun, of melodies in the Hasidic. Maybe I'll say briefly that one of the hallmarks of the various Hasidic dynasties, and to this day, one of the more beautiful elements was the practice of creating wordless melodies known as nigunim, a nigun or a nigun. And that too was part of the revolution, saying the highest level is maybe not letters and words, but silence and connection. And the Baal Shem Tov and his students were very much about finding a way for people to connect directly to God without intermediaries. And of course, it's very ironic, of course, that the Hasidic movement then very much spawned a very intermediated movement with the tzaddik and the righteous one, who was holier than the rest of the students. But still, nonetheless, it was still as egalitarian as it could be. And in the Neo-Hasidic world that I'm a part of, I remember one teaching from my teacher, Reb Zalman, where he was sitting once with a group of students, and he was giving over Torah, he was teaching, and then he got up at the end of teaching, and he had everybody move one chair over and invited everybody to sit in the chair that he had been sitting in to tell over their Torah, to teach their truth, right? To speak their connection, right? So I have a couple of questions here, and I'll address them, and then if there are other questions.
Well, before you get the questions, let me moderate so you have a moment.
Sure.
Just to breathe.
Can you see the ones that were sent directly to me, or
I can see a lot of ones, but I also want to make sure we get to questions that I want to cover. And if you see things that you want to cover, we don't have time to answer every question, and some are very specific. And if you live in Orange County, California, you can come to Shabbat and ask any question you want, because Rabbi Ingber will be there. So, one of the questions that people ask, I think, is relevant, is you are the head rabbi of Romemu. You have two sites, Romemu. You have Manhattan and you have Brooklyn. What parts of Neo-Hasidism do you incorporate into your services? What makes your services Neo-Hasidic as opposed to just Hasidic, or not anything to do with Hasidism? So if someone walked into Romemu, how would they know that this is a Neo-Hasidic place?
Well, it's in a church, so that'll give it away right away. It's we're in a church. We are.
Well, no, there are quite a few minions I've been to in churches. So
I know. So let me just say that it's hard to imagine exclusively being, we call ourselves Neo-Hasidic, but Neo-Hasidic, I'd say is kind of like an aesthetic and an inflection. There are many communities that have been influenced by Hasidism and have adopted Hasidic teachings. And at this point in the American Jewish landscape, it would be hard to say that you would, if you walked into our shul and you walked into, let's say, another very well-known community in New York City, B'nai Jeshurun, or tonight at Temple Beth El, tomorrow night at Temple Beth El, there's a lot of crossover between what was taken from Hasidism and became Neo, in all of these different communities. It's had a major influence on reform, on Reconstructionism, on renewal, on orthodoxy even. So, unlike Hasidism, which has really distinct external indicators of a movement, the garb, right? Nobody at Roma wears specific garb. I hope I'm not dressed. I mean, I don't know if I look Hasidic to you, but I certainly think I look like all of you. I think that it's the angle and the approach and the questions that we ask of the text, which are generally indicative of a renewal or Neo-Hasidic style Torah, right? If you ask the Torah, tell me, right, about my mind and my heart from this text, I would say that's a Hasidic question, and it leads to a particular way of interpreting Torah. The way that we sing and the way that we dance, we place a very strong emphasis on experiencing God's presence in the shul. But that, I think many shuls do that. So I think that it comes down to a certain tom, a certain style of a feel in the room. And I think Romamu, like many synagogues, incorporate that tom into the way that we practice our Jewish life.
Again, you can experience that in person Friday night and Shabbat at Temple Bethel. Dale asks, well, what's the difference between Neo-Hasidism and Jewish Renewal then?
I don't think there is, frankly. I think that, Jewish Renewal is my teacher's version of Neo-Hasidism, and Arthur Green has his particular style. Again, like there are different aesthetics, just like there are multiple dynasties or different, like Chabad Hasidism is very different in ways than, let's say, Polish Hasidism. The emphasis on different pieces, like an Apple computer is a computer, and so is a PC, but they have different operating systems and different approach, and they're still both computers. Conservative Judaism is a little bit different, let's say, depending on what the melodies and the style. I think a lot of those things are stylistic and emphasis.
Do you incorporate other? Well, Naomi wants to know your relationship to other great mystical traditions. Do you study them? Do you bring those into your practice, into the synagogue, into your teaching?
Absolutely. So my teacher used to say that all of the religions are organs in the planetary body, and he wanted all of the organs to be healthy. And so I think that mysticism, by and large, not always, but by and large, offers what some people call the perennial wisdom, perennial psychology or perennial philosophy. It kind of takes the essence, as it were. I myself am more halachically observant, and my practice is a bit conservative that way. But generally speaking, I'm a big fan of the mystical insights in all of the religious traditions, and we incorporate them in teachings and so on and sayings. And when I write a sermon, I'll often cross-reference. We don't practice other religious traditions. We are a Jewish community, but we do mindfulness meditation, and for a period of time, yoga was an important part of our spiritual community as well. And so, but I think the spiritual cross-training is a very important thing to do at this point in our history. I think that we can't expect every religious tradition to offer all of the nutrients that we spiritually need in order to be well-rounded. And so I'm a big fan of meditation in different traditions, including Jewish meditation as well.
As I mentioned when we started, you have many hats, many kippot, I guess. Founder of Romamu. You have 2 sites of Romamu. Since January, you've been the head of the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life. What's your goal for the Bronfman Center? Like, what are you going to bring there, teaching spirituality that you don't do at Romamu, or maybe it's the same thing? So if people drop into the, what do you call it now? They call it 92 NY. Is that what it is? What are they going to find there that's different than at Renewal?
And we'll wait and see. I mean, I've been there for 5 minutes. I've only been there for 30, for five or 6 weeks. But it's a very large platform, and I think that there are thousands and thousands of Jews who aren't aware of how beautiful Judaism is, and how relevant it is, and how dynamic it is, and how much of a huge boon it is to our lives at a time of a pretty radicalized individualism here in this country and in the West more broadly. The importance of the messages of Judaism, and particular Hasidic Judaism or Neo-Hasidic Judaism, is that it has tremendous relevance. It speaks a language that is most available right now in the American zeitgeist. right? To speak about personal flourishing and personal meaning. And Hasidism is a great repository of that, and done in a neo way. It kind of takes some of what many of us would say is the baby of Hasidism without a lot of the pre-modern bathwater of Hasidism, and it says you can have what is nourishing in this movement without some of the things that many of us would not countenance, or we wouldn't want those things, right? It's not we. And so I have a question from Mark, who says, does Neo-Hasidism have a place for those who don't believe in God? Of course it does, because Neo-Hasidism focuses on the experience of transcendence without necessarily needing to name it as God or a thing or a being of sorts. And so it's the closest thing we have to, like, you know, when you see Sam Harris and the waking app phenomena of people who want non-religious spirituality, you know, spirituality without the jargon, without the rituals, without the labels. Hasidism offers a direct experience of the presence of the one, you know, that is, or, you know, of that reality. So in that way, Hasidism can fit into that frame as well. I think it offers so much, and it's so rich, and there's so many different teachings, and it's, you know, so I'm hoping that the Y will be a platform to bring that awareness more broadly.
Right. So can we end with the following? One of the things that blew me away when I first met you which is at the Centennial, was we had multiple services going on. I think we had 4 or 5, and I got to go to all the different rooms. And I walked into the room and you were leading davening, and it was amazing, because not only are you a great thinker and obviously a great communicator, but you're a great davener. So I wanted you to share a nigun that would be, you know, Shabbat is almost here. What's today? Today's Thursday. It feels like Friday to me. I don't know why. I know we have another day. You think of a nigun that you could share with us that gets us in the mode, that gets people out of their, you know, out of their house this Friday, so they can come to shul and be with you in person and see what it's like to daven with you. Is that okay? And then we can.
Sure. I mean, you know, there was a great Hasidic master named Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, the Berdichever, Levi Yitzchak Berdichev. And when I had a woman in my community who was an Einiklach, she was a, you know, great granddaughter of the Berdichever. And he had a nigun, a melody that went like this. Ya bye diddy na die nine diddy nine ya bye ya bye diddy nine diddy nine ay diddy nine Giddy na ay Giddy na Giddy na oh ya mama Thank you very much, Ari and everyone, and Claude and all of you here. Have a beautiful, beautiful day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. If you're in Orange County, you know where to go for some soulful davening the Shabbos. If you're in New York, you know where to go for teaching and davening. Thank you, Rabbi Ingber. Thank you, Rabbi Kavod. And we'll see you guys this Shabbat. We'll see you more online with CSP. Take care. Be safe.